Wow. Yeah. And I remember from that incident, um, part of the reason you felt gutted was that there were things you felt you should have said to that judge that you
Mm,
physically couldn't get out in that moment.
mhm.
You weren't ready to.
Right.
And I feel like this comes up a number of times through your memoir, times when you wanted to say something, you felt you should have said something, and you didn't in that moment. And I wonder if the function of memoir, one of the functions of memoir, is to give us space and time to say those things that we
Mm.
didn't get to say.
Oh, absolutely. See, this is why I so wanted to talk to you about this. 'Cause I'm like, people ask you, why did you write this? And I'm kind of like, sometimes I'd love to hear from people who write about why we write the things that we do.
Oh,
you know, yeah, I think that that's true. I think that, I mean, to this day, I feel, and this, I think this is a human emotion or human, widely felt. It can be very hard to say what you actually think or feel in a specific moment because it feels too dangerous, where literally your legs are shaking, right? Like you're trembling. And it's strange because it's like, I would like to, I'd like to say, like there's something really great about this like empowering image of like the strong woman who just goes up to power and tells it like it is. And that's not every once in a while, that's been my experience in life, but I feel like more often than not, it's witnessing how power works, feeling confused, feeling uncomfortable, eventually knowing what I feel outraged about, and finally finding a way to put it on paper.
mhm.
you know but I marvel at people who know how to just jump at that moment and say certain things. um Sometimes I think it's theater because I think sometimes it simply takes a while to see things clearly. And I'll give you the example of this judge. When I went to see him, one of my girlfriends, she was like, oh my God, you must have wanted to punch him in the face. Like she was so angry for me. And I told her, I was like, actually, no, that's not how I felt about him. How I felt about him was, on the one hand, here is a guy who built himself a very comfortable retirement, facilitating a system that is broken. I judge him for that. I also think, here's a guy who didn't need to give me the time of day and talk to me. And he did. And actually, it wasn't because I was an NPR correspondent and I had like a fancy life and he heard me on the radio. He actually remembered me from childhood. He had a couple of vivid memories of me during my father's case. And so he wanted to know whatever became of me. So he had a lot of humanity,
Mhm.
and so I think part of what I let myself do in the memoir is throw the jabs that I wouldn't feel right saying in real life,
Mhm.
but are still true.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, there's a certain amount. If a judge wanted to hear from me and if he wanted to speak to me, I would feel a certain amount of maybe even gratitude for that because he was seeing me as a human, right? As a person.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there can be like a sort of, it's, I wish it weren't the case, but I know part of me is constantly seeking acceptance from the world that rejected my father,
Mhm.
you know? And it's kind of, on the one hand, I feel incredibly touched that the judge in that case made the time. Not only did he invite me into his chambers, as I write later in the book, he invited me into his home to talk with me over a couple of different interviews when I finally had the bandwidth to talk about what had happened. So part of me feels like, look, we're good people. We're we're being respected. We're being treated like humans. And then part of me also feels though like, but why couldn't my dad have that?
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So the case, your father's case, is sort of the center of this memoir.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot surrounding this case.
Mm-hmm.
And much of it is funny, a lot of it is moving. It's not just about the hardship of this court case.
Mm-mm.
Something that struck me was how physical the memory is in this
Mm.
book. So I'm just going to read a couple sentences, if you don't mind.
Please.
Um, so this is about when your parents received their green cards. They had been undocumented for a while, and then they finally received their green cards. When the green cards came in the mail, my parents didn't jump up and down like contestants on The Price is Right. They sat together, taking deep breaths, feeling partial relief, like when you stretch a limb that's been contorted too long and the blood rushes back. So in this passage, they felt relief physically. It was in their body.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also another example. There's like this rhapsodic description of a Big Mac and what that Big Mac was to you as a child, like when your sister bought one for herself. Um, there's this physical description of you reuniting with your parents. They had been physically separated for a while, and there's like this very visceral memory of you holding their bodies together with yours. Can you talk about how the body functioned for you in piecing together your memories and in writing this memoir?
Yeah, it's interesting because so I actually had to put myself, and this is I think a very common experience, in a great deal of isolation to let the memories come back. And because memory is physical. The fact is, you let yourself, when you quiet the world around you, like I was basically pretty much alone and in silence for 6 months, and that's when I sort of pushed the manuscript out. I would just sort of like, I remember, there's another moment I remember that I wrote about that's physical. My mother, when I was little, was hit by a car. It was a hit and run. Her body ricocheted off the car. Her vertebrae was broken. And I didn't see her for, I'm not sure what period of time, but as she was recovering. And then when I saw her again, I remembered wanting to like physically leap onto her, but I saw this frail woman like in a neck brace and like weak. And she didn't look like my mother anymore. She looked like an older broken version of my mother, like, but I remember like that scene. Shanti, I was so surprised it came back to me. I wasn't looking for it. I think it's like sitting alone day in and day out, memories coming out. And you push out memories, Like I would just make myself write, like at the beginning, I was like 4,000 words a day, just push out, push out, push out. And then let's see what sticks. And that process of pushing out, which again, it's physical, right? You're like, I am going to get you, writer's block, you don't exist. Wow, put it, and just doing it and doing it. And then that came up, and I remember being like, wow, and just sitting there and crying, like, just physically feeling like the burn in my heart that I probably felt when I was little.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of burn of rejection, that you're not being rejected, but you feel like you are because what you want so badly is to be held. And I think that throughout for me, a lot of the physicality is, listen, I had a very insecure childhood. I didn't grow up feeling protected. I grew up constantly knowing that there are threats everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the yearning to be held, it's so intense and it's constantly in those memories that I guess in some ways it showed up on the page too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's yeah, I can absolutely see that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to remind viewers that we're going to be taking questions from you. So if you have questions for Aarti, please enter them. I think there's a Q&A box there for you to enter your questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. I still have plenty of questions for you, Aarti. So speaking of your mother's accident, your father's court case, there were so many sort of jaw-dropping obstacles that your family had to wrangle with during their time, mostly in America, but also back in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like your book and my book, they spoke to each other in so many ways.
Oh yeah, I loved your book.
Yeah, thank you.
Lucky boy, everybody, lucky boy. Yeah.
we're not here to talk about Lucky Boy.
Well, go ahead. Okay.
All right. So what was I going to say? This is my cat, by the way.
Oh, hey.
She's going to be part of this now.
All right. Cool.
One thing that I think our books have in common is the resiliency of immigrants and immigrant families.
Mm-hmm.
And your family and the things that they went through displayed such grit and such resiliency, like just constantly bouncing back and coming back and climbing back up.
Mm-hmm.
How has that sort of influenced your path in life, or maybe your path as a journalist or a writer?
Yeah. You know, there's this little line in my head that it's kind of like this inner mantra of like, Aarti, whatever it is you think you're going through right now, it just doesn't compare to what mom and dad went through. Like, it's kind of, like I can give an example. When my father was arrested, my first reaction was shame, deep, deep, deep shame. As the case unfolded, it eventually turned to outrage. So much outrage that basically as a teenager, I started being my family lawyer, and I started advocating and trying to push back on the legal breakdowns that were happening around us. And I thought I was going to fight for a year. I didn't fight for 1 year. I fought until I was 30 years old. So much longer than I'd expected. And by the time I was like 30, 31, I was finally done fighting the legal stuff that had kind of blown up in our faces. I was just like, okay, Aarti, who do you want to be now? What do you want to do? And I had decided, it wasn't a straight line, and I explain how in the book, but I basically decided I wanted to pivot from a decade of activism for my family and other immigrants in New York. I wanted to pivot to journalism. And that, there's a media reckoning happening right now in this country. And there is this longstanding issue in the newsroom of whether activists can be journalists. Are we capable of being objective? What is objectivity? Who gets to speak? What is bias? Whatever. I remember I wanted to pivot into journalism, and it was hard because I basically had to, in some sense, kind of cut off my entire ecosystem that I built through my 20s and built a brand new one in my 30s. I had to learn to speak a new language. Like prior to 31, I don't think I knew what an algorithm was. And then knowing it and reporting around its creation and deployment became like my bread and butter, right? And I know, like, when I was going through that, I felt very alienated from myself. I felt like I had put this heart of mine in an icebox for safekeeping, and I just wanted to exist here, and I just wanted to push and push and push to have like a safe middle-class American life. That's sort of what I stated my goal was. And part of what I know made me feel like, girl, like, you got this. And even if you don't got this, everything's going to be okay. Is like, I was like, Aarti, when your parents were just a little bit older than you, they crossed the Atlantic with 3 kids and were undocumented in Queens. Like, there's nothing you're doing that's that risky.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize that you're just not taking risks comparable to the risks they took, somehow it feels more manageable.
Yeah, learning about algorithms, pretending that you know about them seems like small potatoes in comparison, although I find it intimidating.
Well, I now know a lot more. We can talk about it.
Okay. Speaking of your work as a journalist, you said in the book that your pivot to Silicon Valley, to tech journalism, was you putting your heart away and leading with your head.
Yeah.
With Silicon Valley being so heavily populated by immigrants, by people from other countries who work in tech, do you feel that your heart is out a little bit because of that?
I'm sorry, my heart is out.
Like, do you feel like your heart, like if we equate your heart with your own experience, with your experience of immigration and your family's life, do you feel like some of that, do you feel some reverberations of your own life and your family's life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I actually think that part of there's so many different reasons I needed to write this book. I mean, ultimately, it was like an existential need, right? But I know that like being here and seeing how like yet again, just like in my prep school brewery, there are so many migrants here, again erased from the narrative, erased like culturally. They're like, you know, sidekicks and or invisible.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, you know, there are people here who they've been living in limbo for a decade, 2 decades. You know, they came here with their husband or wife. They're like, you know, holding their breaths. And I just know that, you know, I relate and I want, you know, whatever class echelon you come from, what they call skilled workers or unskilled, or now we're thankfully calling them essential workers because we're
Mhm.
seeing that in COVID. I think that there is an experience of living in this constant uncertainty where you were bold enough to take your shot, and you happen to come at a time where the world has decided to turn villains and, you know, heroes into villains, you know.
Mhm.
And that's the thing I wrote in my book, and it's actually now become the cover of the paperback. I wrote, to migrate to America, to cross the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean or the Sonoran Desert is the boldest act of one's life. You do it to be the hero of your own story. Only God must have a sense of humor because, as every undocumented immigrant knows, you cannot cross over and stand proud. You have to be invisible. That's safer than being seen by the wrong people. Invisible heroes. That was my parents in a nutshell. And I think that a lot of people feel that. A lot of people feel that I'm supposed to apologize for the thing I'm the most proud of.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. And reporting from Silicon Valley is a way to celebrate that, or to give it some sunlight, some exposure.
Yes and no. I mean, I'm going to be honest, like, I think that reporting in Silicon Valley and landing here had more to do with my fascination with how power works than it had to do with any kind of migrant identity. Like,
Mhm.
I came here because it was like the most rational decision of my entire life.
Mhm.
I was new to journalism. There was this part of the country that was growing rapidly that was not in New York or Washington, D.C., which meant there were fewer journalists here, which meant there was less competition for great jobs, which meant that if I
Mhm.
plant myself in this place and I understand how it works, I will get a great job. And so that was really the motivation in coming here. There wasn't any sort of it wasn't mission driven beyond I want to fix my credit score and I want to study power.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and then you brought with it what you brought with it,
Yeah.
what you brought with yourself.
Right, exactly. As every journalist does, exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so we have a couple questions that I want to start working in here. We have one from Sapna. She says, I loved your book. Living in the Bay Area, I really think the book is an important way for Indian Americans to think of immigration too. It's not always the rosy tech engineer picture often painted in the media. What types of conversations have you had with the Indian community about the significance of this story?
That's a great question, Sapna. Um, Inevitably, I get asked by a lot of Vesis, how did you feel okay talking about family problems? Because we don't talk about family problems. We're supposed to be model minorities, right?
Mhm.
And quite simply, my answer to that is that when my father was arrested when I was a teenager, we were so instantly rejected by the Indian American community in Queens that that's not who I looked to for emotional support. Much of my emotional support ended up coming from immigrants from different parts of the world, Americans, white Americans, Black Americans. And so I think that the rejection, for example, like no longer going to Indian functions on the weekends, not having people coming over our home, I stopped having to look for acceptance. And it gave me a certain kind of freedom to write. Um, but I think that the motivation when I've been asked that question has to do often with, for example, mental health issues, people feeling unduly pressured to live out a dream that is not theirs, and on the brink of suicide, if not actually attempting it. Domestic violence being a huge issue in our community, huge issue that we don't talk about. And so, I think in some ways my book gives voice to the emotional journey of migration, but I hope it also gives permission to people who feel like we're supposed to be model, but we're real people, and no real people are model.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think this next question relates to that somewhat.
Mm.
From Angelica. She says, how do you think the pressure to assimilate in the US shaped your experience? Have you noticed a shift of the immigrant experience from needing to assimilate to a different type of experience, from needing to assimilate to a different type of experience
Mm. Mm.
today?
Yeah, Angelico, I'm not sure how to pronounce. I would say that, so when I write in my book about how my family came here. We overstayed visas. We were undocumented. Then we got our papers through a process that has been derided as chain migration. This is something I find very funny about language. Is like literally like the first time in the news I heard the term chain migration, I was like, that sounds great. Like, because to me it's like, oh, every family member is like a link in the chain, and you add links, and the family grows bigger and stronger. Like to me, it was just kind of like a good thing, but I didn't realize like it took me a minute to be like, oh, they're saying it like it's a bad thing. But the fact is, we managed to get our papers in a handful of years. I know that little Aarti coming today in the exact same situation of, being born somewhere else, coming here by visa or not, through the petition my family used, for example, the wait time now is not 3 years. The wait time now is like 23, 24 years, which means that for the current Aarti, the current little Aarti, as opposed to the past ones, like me, you don't get your legal status, you don't get financial aid for schools, you don't get good employment, you don't get access to good jobs, you don't get scholarships. Like basically all of the architecture that made it possible for me to live the dream. And actually I feel I have, my book, Here We Are, the subheading is American Dreams, American Nightmares, because I believe my father lived the nightmare. I believe I in fact did live the dream, and I believe they coexist. But what concerns me is that increasingly the kids coming here today who were in my situation, they're not, it's been killed. People say go stand on line. There's no line to stand on. Like, what line are you talking about? And so I think that the adaptation that migrants have to make now that was not true in prior centuries or decades. I mean, like Ellis Island immigrants who make up the majority of migration history to the US, on average, the wait time at Ellis Island was 5 hours. I mean, it was nothing. So, I think that basically, because there is no line to stand on, but people are and will continue to come here, my fear is that we're forcing the migrant experience into being one of constant lifelong uncertainty, as opposed to the chance of climbing into the dream.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I'm a little worried on that front. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Um, Now, thinking of that, I liked how you just said that, you were living a dream and your father was living a nightmare,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that those two can coexist. I want to talk a little bit about your father. He's kind of like, in a way, the main character of this book, aside from you.
Mm-hmm.
You call him your best friend in the book. When did you realize that your father was your best friend?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think I realized it when I moved out to San Francisco.
Mhm.
Like, I was finally leaving home. Um, like I was like literally in the course of a handful of months, I got my driver's license, which I didn't have. I got it when I was 30. I got my driver's license. I was pivoting into journalism. I broke up with my now ex-fiance. I was just kind of like, I can't do any of this. I'm out. And I remember like a series of events happened. I moved to San Francisco. And then he'd be the one I talked to every day. Either he'd call me or I'd call him. Um, he was the first person to come and visit me. And that wasn't like him saying, "Oh, I want to come visit you." I was like, "Dad, I miss you. Why don't you come and see where I live now?" And I like, it was funny. My relationship with my mom is, I love my mom, but she also drives me crazy. Like, it's the both. And like, I specifically was like, "Mom, Dad's going to come. You're not going to come."
My mom would never let that happen.
I think her feelings were a little bit hurt, but she also understood. I think that she felt happy to see that, like, we had such a strong relationship, because my father, the fact is he really struggled with depression. That's not something I knew how to understand in my 20s. But I think that, as I got older and I kind of saw him in his situation more clearly, um, it just, I think she was happy that there was at least somebody he felt like opening up to. Um, and we just had so much peace between us, like, we talked about things well. He was an excellent listener, like, every once in a while he'd annoy me specifically about the marriage question. But besides that, like, I think that when I moved out here and I felt so like, holy crap, what are you doing, girl? Like, is this going to work? And then I kept looking to him to be like my companion in a certain way, even remotely. That's probably when I realized
Mhm. Mhm.
how much he meant to me. Like, he specifically,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And what do you think you would say about this country today? Put those words together.
I think he'd be in disbelief. I mean,
Yeah.
he was incredibly entertained by Donald Trump in the tabloid New York Post version of him in the 80s and early 90s. I mean, my father, I think that, Trump was one of those figures that just sort of stood out to Dad as like how larger than life characters in New York are.
Mm.
Just like mafioso level, like, that kind of person. So, like, I know Trump's life, like, he found it, like a lot of New Yorkers, like, we found it fascinating. Like, I remember when I got the scholarship to my school, the prep school, like, my father didn't think it was a big deal, because in his mind, he's like, "Oh, well, if they're giving you a scholarship, it must not be that valuable." And
Mhm.
I was like, Dad, just so you know, Donald Trump's daughter goes to the school just like this across the street. And I got into that school too. He's like, "Oh, Trump's daughter goes." And that helped him to calibrate what a big deal it was. Right. But like, back to American politics today and what might he think about what's happening in this country? In some ways, it might be disbelief. But the other thing I do have to say, though, because I think he was a very astute observer about this country, and he always used the word about America. He says it's a land of confused people.
Mhm.
And confused, meaning that, with all of the individualism, with all the driving towards goals, he felt that people were in general less rooted in community and less rooted in that people sway here, that people sway very hard here. So in that sense, I think actually he wouldn't be so surprised. He might be quite optimistic about the ability to sway back to something that's not crazy. I'm not
Mhm.
sure. But yeah, no, I am often kind of like, wow, Dad, like, if you could only believe what's happening right now.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so one thing that I noticed about the book is that it's written with so much love. There's just so much love in this book, amid all the hardship, amid the drama, amid the suffering. There is love.
Mhm.
So I have one more question for you, and it has to do with this little sort of mental game you played with yourself towards the end of the book. You asked yourself how each of your family members would answer this question, and the question is, what does it take to make America home? And you imagined that your sister would say humor, your brother would say Sylvester Stallone movies, your mother would say sharing, your dad would say patience, and you would say rage, which I found really an interesting answer. Can you talk about that?
But I qualified it, right? I said rage.
It could be hope,
Yeah.
right?
They go together.
Mm-hmm.
You don't actually bother to rage unless you have hope,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? If you don't have hope, the response to your environment is something more like depression. It's
Mm-hmm.
something more like disengaging. It's something more like shutting yourself off from the stimulation around you. And I think that, I mean, part of what I was working through in this book is how could I be so angry and yet so optimistic? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what makes that? And so, you know, when I say rage and hope, I think it's almost like a trick answer because I think actually they're the same. They come together. Yeah.
They do. They do. I feel like you wouldn't rage if you didn't believe in a future for the thing that you're
So
raging.
I mean, that's actually, you know, Shanti, like, the thing that I want people, like, you know, we all have our 2 cents about what people need to know right now. What are the ways to help us through what we're dealing with as a country and a pandemic? Before any of this, you know, a lot already going wrong. And I feel a lot of disappointment in younger Aarti. Like, in some ways, I respect her because she fought really hard. Like, she really threw herself into it. In other ways, I feel like she was kind of like myopic and calcifying inside. Um, you
Is
know,
this activist Aarti or is this younger Aarti?
activist Aarti,
Uh-huh.
Aarti in her 20s, who became, you know, kind of like a freedom fighter in some ways, you know. Um, when you become all about a cause, you actually lose your humanity, right? I felt it happen. Like I write a scene in my book where I talk about that very explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what I wish that she had been more capable of was just, and this is a word I'll just sort of throw out as I think really for me like a survival guide to right now, is duality. You know, can you be big enough inside that you can contain both all of your righteous outrage at what is broken, and man, are there things broken? Can you see it clearly? Can you be honest about it and not hide it? But can you also, with the same clarity and force, celebrate what works? And
Mm-hmm.
part of what worries me is that we live in a culture that, also reinforced by a set of technologies, keeps telling you choose a side, choose a side, choose a side. Which side are you on?
Mm-hmm.
And so, is it safe to say, and does it make sense to people to say, this is a country that destroyed a good man, and this is a country that gave me more than I could ever have imagined, right? That duality is there. And so I just feel like I wish the younger her had been more capable of cultivating, just holding what were obviously conflicted feelings in there. She would have navigated her situation better if she knew how to let more gratitude in. And
Mm-hmm.
the converse of that is when people just preach gratitude and they're not willing to see what's broken, I don't trust it. I'm like,
Yeah.
come on, you know, like this isn't the Hallmark lane, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. Absolutely. So we have one more comment from a viewer, and I think this sums our session up really nicely. It's from Tiff C.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both and Green Apple for taking the time out of your schedules to host this author's talk. It was a comforting semblance of normalcy during this tumultuous time. Your story resonated strongly with me as a Chinese American and first generation. Here's hoping for an in-person event in the near future.
Oh,
So thank you, Tipsy, for that lovely comment. I think that might be a good place for us to wrap up our
great.
discussion. Aarti, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I want to encourage people to get the book. Please get the book, and please get the book from Green Apple Books, who are
Yeah.
hosting your event.
I'm actually here signing them right now. And I have to plug Lucky Boy as well by Shanthi, because it is an excellent read that is both about migration and also just fundamentally about motherhood. And it dropped in my lap in a kind of unusual way, and I can't believe how I devoured it. So, basically, if you're going to do the checkout and buy my book, add Lucky Boy. Yeah.
Me as well. It's just a little button.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you.
And so the book is available on the Green Apple website. Is that right, Green Apple?
It is, yeah. And if you buy from Green Apple, you'll get an autographed copy. That's right.
Excellent. Even better.
Yeah.
Bookstore and online.
Bookstore and online. Okay, great. Yeah. Independent bookstores, they're still around. Support them.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Aarti.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
your
your
pleasure.
time. Yeah.
And thank you, Green Apple Books. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight.
All right. Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Your masks.
There we go. Bye.